So how can we provide the task status options here now? Well, we could do that in the main.ts file by adding it to the providers array. If you would do that, then the value would be injectable in the entire application. But actually, I only need it in the tasks list component and the task item component, which is actually a child component of the tasks list component. And therefore, providing it there would be enough in this application. So we could do that. We can go to the tasks list component TypeScript file and there to the component decorator object and add this providers array. And then here I want to add a provider which uses a custom injection token. And therefore I'll go to the task model TS file and also export an injection token here. We don't have to do it here, but I guess it makes sense to keep it close to the value that will be injected. And I'll name my token here task status options written like this, because that's also a common notation you'll often see for injection tokens, that this all caps notation here is being used. But ultimately, it's up to you which name you want to use for your injection token. But here I'll then import injection token from @AngularCore and construct a new one like this. And then also add this description, task status options. And I want to let TypeScript know which kind of data will be provided through that injection token. And that, of course, will be this task status options thing here, which has this type signature. Therefore, I'll actually grab this type definition, cut it, and set it up as a separate custom type so that we can easily reuse it, and name this task status options like this. Assign that as a type here and use it here. With that, it's clear that this injection token here will be used to provide a value of this shape, an array full of objects with this shape here. In the tasks list component, we can therefore now use this task status options token here after importing it from task model. By the way, this service import isn't needed here anymore, but this token is. And then we have to use one of these use properties. And now it's not a class I want to provide, but instead a value, which we can do with use value. Because it's a simple constant array which I want to provide, which is a simple value in the end. It's not a class that needs to be instantiated first. Instead, it's an existing value. An alternative would be to use factory. That would take a function which is then executed in case you had some value that needs to be generated dynamically, which could be the case for more complex values. But here it's really just use value, and then it's this task status options value, this constant, which is imported from task model. Therefore, what I'll actually do here is I'll cut this provider object definition from my tasks list component and remove these imports, and instead go to the task model file and set that up here. Because I have the value and the token here, why not also define the provider here? So I'll export a constant named task status options provider, which will store this provider configuration, and which should be of type provider, which is a type that's imported from @AngularCore. You don't need to add that here, but by doing so, you make sure that you have a correct definition here and you don't have a typo in here, for example. So that's why I'm explicitly setting that type. And with that back in the tasks list component, it's now simply that task status options provider, which I'll import and add here, which keeps the code here a bit leaner. Well, and with that, finally, this provider is set up and registered with the element injector of this component. So it's available in this component and all child components, and we can therefore now inject it. For example here, by adding a new property, which we could name task status options, the name is up to you though, which holds a value which we get with help of the inject function or with help of the constructor. You could also inject it there, as you learned. But it's easier with the inject function because here we now just need our token, task status options, written like this, and of course imported from the task model file, and that's all. This adds this task status options property, which we can now use to access the injected value. And therefore in the tasks list component HTML file, we can now generate some of these options here dynamically. We can remove them here and use add_for to loop through all the options of our task status options and track the option value, for example, as a unique identifier, and then output one option element for every option in that injected array. So it's then the option text that's output here. For the value, it should be the option value. And that's now a dynamic value. So we need the property binding syntax here to bind the value property of this option to the dynamically resolved value from the option object here. And if we do all that, and we save that all, if you go back to the application, you see that you have still the same options as before here. And we can also check whether they work. By changing the filter. And that looks good to me. So we got the same options as before here in that filter dropdown. But now they are generated dynamically based on this injected value, which is now not a service, but instead some other value, which we injected with help of a custom injection token. And now we can, of course, also inject that same value into the task item component. Since that is a child component of the tasks list component, it will have access to the element injector of the tasks list component, and it will be able to inject the task status options. So in the task item component TypeScript file, we can add our task status options as well and inject them by using the task status options injection token, which of course also must be imported here. And the service import isn't needed here anymore. We can remove that, but this token must be injected. And with it injected, we can go to the template here and now render these options dynamically. So again, we can use add_for to go through the options of task status options and track the option value. And then for every option in the task status options array, I want to output an option element where the value is bound dynamically to option.value, where selected is bound dynamically to task status being equal to option.taskStatus, which is open, in progress, or done, and where the text here is set to option.text, like this. That's the code I want to have here. With that, we can get rid of these hard-coded options, and we now render this dropdown with all its options dynamically, again, based on that injected value. With that, again, if we add some tasks here, like this dropdown works, changing the status also works, and filtering based on that status also works just fine. All without any errors here in the console or here where the development server is running. And that's therefore an example for a custom provider that provides a non-service, a non-class value. Instead, a provider that provides a regular array, which can then be injected into all interested components. Here, I do register that provider with the element injector, but as I mentioned before, you could of course also register it application-wide with the root environment injector, for example. So now that we had a very close look and a pretty deep dive into services and dependency injection, it's worth noting that you can use all these features and concepts you learned about not just with standalone component, which is what we used in this project thus far, but also with modules when creating Angular modules with ng module. In that case, you would create those modules as you learned it before in the course. You would declare your components, import any other modules you might need, and you also have a providers array there, which you can set up. Because when using modules, then in the main.ts file, you start your application by calling bootstrap module on this platform browser dynamic thing here. And bootstrap module then takes the app module as an input. And you can then use this providers array here on this module to register providers with that module injector, which works essentially like the application root environment injector here, since it will make whatever you're providing here available to your entire application, since this is the root app module of the application. You could also pass a configuration object as a second argument to Bootstrap module and there set up some providers, but it is a bit more common to do that in the app module. Now, if you would be using multiple modules, you could also add providers to your nested modules, but behind the scenes, they would all be merged together into one module injector. Unless you load nested modules lazily, but that's a more advanced technique to which I'll get back later in the course. But in general, when you work with modules, no matter if it's just one module or multiple modules, you can register values, you can provide values with this providers array here, and if you're working with multiple modules, they will be merged together. And everything else works just the way you learned it. You can still use custom tokens, you can use the more common shortcut, so that if you're injecting a service, you're just providing it like this. That would also work if you don't want a custom token. So that all won't change. It's just that extra module injector with which you can now register your injectable services and values.